Relations at Stanford University. I would like to give you a view of the major theories that have affected arguments about democratization and wealth. And the basic point I would like to make is that having high levels of wealth and consolidated democracy is actually very difficult. It has happened only in a few places in a small number of areas of the world. I want to begin with modernization theory because I think that's an argument that is very well known, not only in North America, but in other parts of the world as well. The basic argument of modernization theory is that if you have technological change, and you have population growth, you'll get development. If you get development, you'll get democratization. You'll get a larger middle class, and the larger middle class will defend democracy. So it's a very well-known argument. If you look at democracy, you've only had democracy in the world in a small number of places, maybe for 200 years, maybe for even less. So you've had democracy in East Asia, in North America and Western Europe, and a relatively small number of countries have become rich and democratic. So if you look at the period, say, from 1800 on, when you begin to have rising incomes, most of the empirical evidence supports modernization theory. One indication of this is how much of a growth there's been in urban areas. So if we think about London, perhaps you had 1 million people in London in 1800. By 2000, you had 8 million people in London. If you look at Berlin, you had perhaps 175,000 people in Berlin in 1800. By 2000, there were 3 million people in Berlin. If you look at Seoul, at the beginning in, say, the year 2000 or 1890, you had perhaps 250,000 people in Seoul. By 2021, you had more than 9 million people, almost 10 million people in Seoul. So when we think about modernization theory, basically it's all good things go along together, everything happens, you get population growth is pretty much automatic, technological change is pretty much automatic, population change and technological change leads to greater wealth leads to a larger middle class favors democracy, all good things go together. If you can just find your way to the up escalator, you're going to keep going up. You're going to go up constantly because technological change will continue to happen and population growth will continue to happen. This was not a very easy thing for people to understand. After all, when we think about the Industrial Revolution, it begins around 1800. You get rapid levels of urbanization. You get some thinkers, especially in London, which is where it really begins, but it wasn't easy for them to grasp. So if we think about great thinkers of modernization, you have initially Marx, you have also Max Weber had a very different view of how things would happen. We think about Marxism. I mean, here you have Marx living in London in the middle of the 19th century. You look around you, you could see that things were rapidly changing. You were getting the development of railways, you were getting the development of steamships, you ultimately got the development of the telegraph. It wasn't easy to figure out what was going on, but what Marx did see is that things weren't so great for many people. So Marx thought a lot about this, and he thought, okay, we have a system which is based on capitalism, which is that the means of production are privately owned, and we have a free market for labor. The state is there to basically preserve the system, and you have the development of an ideology which basically legitimates the system. So the market works, the market is just. There was a general view that things were working. The argument was that things were working pretty well, even though most of the people were living in poverty. So Marx looked at this and he said, look, this system isn't working well for a large number of people. And one of the fundamental problems was to understand how you actually generated wealth in a society and how you actually got prices. And Marx, actually following lots of arguments that were made at the time, argued that the price of goods was basically a function of the amount of labor that was embodied in goods. All right, here's a basic problem. The cost of labor is basically the cost of reproducing labor. Either you have living labor or you have dead labor, which is labor that's embodied in capital. But you only have to pay them enough money to keep them alive, which was Marx's great insight. So you pay the workers a kind of minimum wage to keep workers alive. You were able to sell goods for a higher price because the price of the good was based on the amount of labor that was embodied in the production. Now, the problem that Marx saw was this. He saw that if you exploited labor, you basically had the exploitation of labor. You're paying money, the amount of money that you needed to keep it alive. You were selling the goods at a higher price, but ultimately the price of goods would decline. So what did Marx say? He said, look, there is an incentive in capitalism to have technological development. What does technological development mean? It means that you have higher levels of capital and lower levels of labor. If you can introduce a new technology, you may be able to get a lot of profits, but ultimately, other people will copy the technology. They'll drive the price of goods down. As the price of goods declines, the owners of production become more and more desperate. So you have falling rates of profit. So what do capitalist societies do in response to that? They engage in various measures to try and increase the level of production. So they engage in imperialism. They try to get cheap sources of raw materials. They try to export capital to other parts of the world because you can get high levels of profit. They try to support technological change. They engage in military spending. Ultimately, all of these things will fail. Imperialism leads to war. New technology ultimately may increase your profits in the short run, but it decreases your profits in the long run. So ultimately, capitalism is going to fail. You're going to have an evolution to a Marxist communist society in which everybody is able to do whatever they want and in which they'll have to work for a relatively limited amount of time. Obviously, you also had another prominent thinker at the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, that is Max Weber. Weber didn't think that everything was based upon economics, and he rejected Marx's argument that there was a single cause. And basically, Weber's problem was this. He said, look, here we have capitalism. People are working very hard, but they're saving their money. They're investing their money. That's a kind of abnormal thing to do most of the time. In the past, if you look at people, they'd spend their money on luxury goods or swords or armor or something. But they hadn't tried to save their money. So Weber asked himself the question, why are people actually saving money and investing it? And Weber's argument was that it was based on a religious set of beliefs, and especially was based on Protestantism. What Protestantism said was that you are elected. No matter what you do, your fate is determined. That made people very anxious because they didn't know whether they were going to heaven or going to hell. So they sought for signs that they were among the chosen, they would go to heaven. And what they seized upon was this notion that if you were prosperous, you lived in the world, you lived well in the world, that that was an indication that you were chosen. So people saved money, not because they wanted to invest, not because they wanted to become richer, but because they wanted some indication that they were chosen. This argument about modernization is clearly an argument that's widespread around the world. It was clearly an argument that was made by many thinkers in the 20th century, especially in the United States, especially because they wanted some alternative to Marxism. And this is an argument that has been very widely studied. So modernization and democracy are connected with higher levels of economic development. This relationship holds up pretty well. There's one period in which it clearly fails, and there's a period between 1945 and 1990. And the argument there is that neither the Soviet Union nor the United States was that interested in democracy. They were interested in countries that would support them. So neither the Soviet Union nor the United States really supported democracy. In fact, they supported leaders who supported either the Soviet Union or the United States. So there were these important exceptions to this argument about democratization. The second finding was that while this relationship between high levels of wealth and democracy generally holds, it holds up until about $10,000, and then it begins to fall apart. So if you get higher levels of income, it doesn't necessarily mean that you become democratic or that you transition from an autocratic regime to a democratic regime. There have been a few smaller countries like Singapore that have become wealthier, although they may not be democratic. But the number of countries that have actually become wealthier and democratic is actually very small. In fact, only one, and that is South Korea. So if we look at modernization theory writ large, it's true that it's certainly a benefit if you become wealthier, but it's no guarantee that you'll actually become democratic, and actually becoming democratic is pretty unusual. So if we look at modernization theory, you look at the United States and offshoot of Britain, you look at Britain, or you even look at Germany or Japan, they're countries that were conquered by the United States after World War II. But if you look at other countries since World War II, the United States, which believes that democracy is kind of a natural order of things, and it is true that countries that have become democratic or wealthier, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that you will reach democracy. So modernization theory is great, but it clearly does not tell us anything. It doesn't tell us everything that we need to know about how countries become wealthy and how they become democratic. You may be wealthier, you will not necessarily become democratic. So let me say, to summarize, what I would say is that modernization theory, we have a lot of empirical evidence that supports it, but it is not perfect. Countries become wealthy, they don't necessarily become democratic. So I think in the United States, it's been a kind of myth that if we could help countries to become wealthy, they would automatically become democratic. That turns out not to be the case. Modernization theory, though, has not stood alone. And in the second lecture, I want to talk about institutional capacity theory, which is an alternative to modernization theory. So institutional capacity theory is really an alternative to modernization theory. And it's basically an argument that says you need stability. If you don't have stability, you're never going to become rich. And I'll try and elaborate this theory in my next lecture.